We're prepping some black walnut for a custom coffee table for a customer with a live edge river in the middle. So we need to square it up along the edges to a rough length and square up the outside edge so that the actual table will be square. We'll be doing this with a circular saw and a straight edge. Mark the location for the straight edge, and clamp that to the board, and clamp the board to the table at the same time. Make sure the piece isn't going to move on you while you're cutting it. So that edge came out nice and straight. There was a lot of binding in it, but definitely came out nice and straight. Now we're going to be removing any loose material from the bark edge so that you don't have any adhesion problems with the epoxy later on. We'll be doing that using chisels and various wire wheels. A large wire wheel will remove most of the material on it and won't leave deep gouges. Switching to a sandpaper wire wheel to smooth out any gouges that have been added to it. And that gives you a clean, debris-free surface, and you'll get maximum adhesion on your epoxy. The worst case scenario, you don't do this properly and your epoxy won't properly grip your wood and you can end up having them separate and break. Now I'll do the same thing with this piece and then we're going to go on to sealing the piece and sealing the edge. Take off any big bulky pieces of bark left with the chisel and remove everything else with the wire wheels. The majority of it's off. Smooth it out with the wire wheel again. And that is a clean edge ready to be sealed with no loose wood, no oils or contaminants on it. So now we're using a wood sealer to coat the edge to make sure that there's no way that air is going to escape from the wood into your epoxy. We're also going to seal the surface of the wood so that nothing will penetrate it. And we also need to get sealer in all of our knot features and gaps. So when we fill them with epoxy during the pour, there's no air escaping from the wood as well. So I'm going to turn this on now and give it a coat. So now I'll let that dry. It's important to get a lot of buildup on the edge, and especially with holes where you really will get a lot of air released from it, and you'll end up with lines of bubbles down the edges of your river. And if you're using a softwood, some of the pigments might also penetrate the top of the wood if it's not properly sealed. So once this dries, I will give it another coat on this side, and I will give it 1 or 2 more coats on the other side and the edge until we have a proper buildup. So we're mixing up the epoxy for the coffee table and the headboard that we're making. So it's a 2.7 to 1 by volume mixture. So I'll be mixing those up now and then thoroughly stirring them, transferring them into another container, stirring them again, and then adding the pigment, doing the final stir, let the air settle, and then pour our tables. It's important to switch containers because any unmixed material in the corners can end up causing a very big problem once you're actually pouring your table. And then we stir for another few minutes. And now I'll let that mixture sit to release any trapped air in the mixture. Because the less air you have in the epoxy before you pour it, the better. It definitely can cause problems with bubbling along your edges. It's best to avoid any sort of bubbling issues. I'll now mix the second half of the mixture. Now we're pouring our deep purple epoxy on both of these items. Always make sure to have a few leveling shims. It's best to have them ready before you pour. And to fill any small gaps and missing knots, cracks, using a syringe is an easy way to control your application of epoxy. Going to use a heat gun to help remove any extra air in it. This is a self-degassing material, but it does generally help a little bit to give it a little bit of heat. You don't want to give it too much heat or you can start to cook your material, and you can also move your pigment with the heat. So just give it a quick quick pass with the heat to heat up the air and encourage it to release just a little bit more. It's helpful in the small knots and voids to get rid of the air that's trapped in those pockets as well. You can see the air bubbles bursting when the heat hits it. They're on the surface, so they should be sanded off, but it doesn't hurt to pop them as they're forming. Pour the last to top up the pour. So you double check before you go, and you make sure that nothing opens up, and make sure everything is level. If it is not level, you're going to have a disaster when you check on it next. So we'll come back to these once they've set, and we'll remove them from the molds, and then we'll work them and see how they look. So now that all the epoxy is fully dried, we're going to remove all the clamps, flip them over, knock it out of the mold, and then run it through the panel sander to smooth it out. Now hopefully these molds don't give us too much trouble coming out. They've been sprayed with a mold release agent. So flip them over, see how easily it comes out. So they came out without damaging the molds at all, so they'll be reusable. And now we'll clean up the surfaces. Now any small holes that remain from air bubbles, we'll fill with epoxy again and then give it one last sand, and then we're ready to finish it, and it's almost complete. So now we've surfaced our panels with a 40 grit, a very aggressive belt, and then we've sanded all of those scratch marks out with an 80 grit. And now before we do our final sand on 150, we're going to fill any spots that may have opened up after sanding. Doing that, we're going to use a syringe with the same color epoxy in it. And now once that epoxy dries, we'll hit it with the last pass with 150, and that'll smooth it out, and then we'll square it up and hit it with the final coat of finish up. And now that we've touched up our epoxy, we sanded it again with 80 grit to smooth it out, gave it a final sand with 150 grit, and then we orbital sanded it and squared it up, sealed it with a vinyl sealer, and then we sanded our vinyl sealer with a 320 grit sandpaper, and then gave it a final coat of lacquer. It's a 40 sheen lacquer on this table. Now that is all that's left is to mount our table legs. So now we've pre-drilled, we marked all of our hole locations using the green tape and just a pencil. And then when you pre-drill, you want to make sure to mark the depth of your pre-drill bit so that there's no chance of you drilling through the top of your table, which would obviously be a disaster. So you want a diameter that's slightly smaller than the diameter of your screw. And you also want to make sure that your screws aren't going to be so long that they'll poke out the top of the table as well. I'll now fasten these using a number 8 Roberts bit. You want to make sure your screws are snug, but you don't want to over tighten them because they'll strip and then they're not holding on to any wood. And here we have the finished product. It's the custom headboard and coffee table that was ordered by a customer. It was both made with black walnut and a midnight purple epoxy and the black steel legs. We couldn't be more happy with how these two products turned out.